Liz, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Phoebe. I'm going to talk about the work of maintaining a spiritual tradition that doesn't have a rule book. So whenever I talk about my work, I usually need to start by explaining what Unitarianism is, because it's a very well-kept secret. So as Laura said, it's a church, but it's one that counters the ideas that many people might hold about what church is like. The core idea is about freedom and inquiry when it comes to beliefs and practices. And so what joins Unitarians together is that we don't have a shared doctrine or dogma that everyone signs up to. Everyone's free to explore their own spiritual path, and doing that with an open mind and doing it in community. To dive quickly into the history, Unitarian Church has its roots in the dissenting Christianity of the 17th century, where the first dissenting ministers felt that it was against their conscience to follow the newly formed Church of England rulebook, but instead felt that it was important to be able to tend their flock according to the call of their own spirit. And so Quakers, that a lot of people have heard of, came out of the same split around the same time. The name Unitarian comes from the early belief that God was one rather than a trinity, and that Jesus was a wise and important teacher, but not God. And so that was enough to make being a Unitarian illegal at the time, which was the case until 1813. And so from that position as outcasts, Unitarians became leaders in early interfaith dialogue and have fought for equality for marginalized groups. So sort of 150 years ago, Unitarians were fighting for broadening access to education for women and working class people. We've had female ministers since 1904. We're one of the first churches in Britain to offer same-sex weddings, which sadly is still very rare. And so today, some Unitarians still identify as Christian. Many are humanist, agnostic, atheist, pagan, Taoist, Buddhist, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu. And each congregation is independent. So they own their own building, they manage their own affairs. And so we're a decentralized movement. So it's a church that's committed to equality, with each congregation owned and led by the community, where there's no insistence on what you should believe or how you should practice, as long as you offer the same open-mindedness to others. And so it's this unique DNA that is why I feel this is a church that's important to maintain. And I'm kind of surprised to find myself leading a church organization. Although I grew up in a Christian family, I stopped believing in God not too long after I stopped believing in Father Christmas. And after studying neuroscience at university, it felt like the paths completely diverged. It felt that religion and science were incompatible. I spent my 20s and the first half of my 30s working in medical publishing. And that's where I kind of honed my maintenance skills. For example, I led a team that maintained the clinical guidance and medication information that sits inside the IT systems that are used by the NHS. So, of course, it had to be up to date, it had to be right, or doctors would be at risk of making the wrong decisions or patients getting the wrong treatment. And as I'm sure many of you sympathise with, that kind of maintenance work isn't very glamorous. And so I never quite had the funding I needed for the number of staff I needed. And so we had to make tough decisions about our work and how best to maintain that medical evidence so that people were cared for well and were not at risk of harm. So as a parallel, you'll probably be aware that most churches in Britain today don't have very many people in them. So there's the same kind of questions. How do we prioritize our work to take the best care of the spiritual experience so that people are well cared for? How does a small group of people tend to the spiritual health of a whole community? So I'll share a bit about what the current work of maintenance looks like for a typical Unitarian church and what that means for our broader spiritual culture. So we have 160 congregations across the UK. Most congregations are led wholly by volunteers rather than paid staff. So the work of maintenance is owned and nurtured for the community and by the community. Each will have a committee of volunteers who take responsibility for the day-to-day decisions behind the scenes. So how to take care of the building, who to share it with, what to do with the money in the bank, how to coordinate the spiritual activities. And half of our congregations have fewer than 20 members. and most of them are in their 70s or 80s. So the maintenance is the responsibility of a small number of people, many of whom have been doing it for a long time. And then in the larger congregations, there will be a minister who's trained for several years. They might also have other staff, like an administrator or someone to take care of the building. And our oldest congregations were formed in the 1600s or 1700s. And then we've had another large wave that were founded in the Victorian era. And many of them survive financially because of the wise moves of those forebears. So they're relying on investments or income from renting out buildings that those wise Victorians built. And often they're not very easy buildings to take care of. And often sort of the more beautiful they are, the more of a headache they are to take care of. So it's really fascinating to work with organisations that are centuries old and generally have been passed hand to hand through the generations of volunteers taking care of them. So there aren't many systems and protocols and standard operating procedures that dictate how things should be run, or even a single sacred text to provide common guidance. So the freedom and inquiry at the heart of Unitarianism means that there's evolution at each stage in each generation. So there's a constant wave of mild heresies that keep the tradition evolving. And there'll be milestones like a new hymn book that mark a coalescence of ideas, which in time will be replaced as new ideas emerge. So the Unitarians of a couple of hundred years ago might be quite shocked by some of the things that happen in our chapels today, like same-sex weddings or readings from different cultures, or prayers and hymns that don't mention God, and not to mention the drop-in standards in the Sunday best. But I feel like those Unitarians of a couple of hundred years ago will still see that the same ethos runs through what's happening today and what they preached in the same pulpits in their day. And this is an idea that I want to drill into a little bit, the evolution of culture as a means to maintain something that is alive and life-giving. Often we think of tradition as conservatism, of keeping things the same. But as the composer Gustav Mahler put it, tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. So in order to maintain the part that matters, we need to allow it to change. Of course, some spiritual traditions thrive on the sense that they're using the same words and the same practices as those who came generations before them. And I can see the appeal of that, but I also see that it can be hard for the outsider to appreciate. If you're new to the tradition, that sense of continuity may be harder to feel a sense of belonging in. If I haven't grown up hearing the repetition of the words of a prayer or the rhythm of the ritual, then it might feel alien to me rather than making me feel like I belong. And because most people in Britain today don't take part in a faith tradition regularly, it feels important to offer something that's accessible to those people, to people who don't already hold that cultural understanding that's passed from generation to generation within a religious group. And for many people, in order to feel like they belong, the practices need to be accessible and to feel culturally relevant. And so to stay relevant, we need continual evolution, an evolution that allows that core ethos to be maintained and understandable, relevant, valuable. And we need it to be protected within a living culture rather than decaying in one that's static. The tension lies in holding on to that ethos with care and allowing enough space for people to try new things. And I'm definitely still learning how this process works. It seems a little like the way it feels impossible to appreciate the music of people a generation or two younger than you. Nothing is guaranteed to make you feel more old and out of touch than switching off the radio and feeling like, what is this rubbish? But even as I switch off the music, I would wholeheartedly support young people's right to make it, and I would want to encourage them to make more, whatever that would sound like to my aging ears. So you can imagine what that looks like in church. There's definitely encouragement of younger people and new members to get involved and for them to take part in training, to learn how to lead services, or even begin ministry training. But there can also be resistance to the ideas and styles that younger people or newer members might bring, because it doesn't exactly replicate what's been happening already. My hunch is that this tension has been going on for generations, with each new wave of leaders making the previous wave feel a bit perplexed about what they're up to. I recently learned that in 1958 in Brixton, the Unitarian Young People's League declared that we need more rock and roll in our churches. But I feel fairly confident that the leaders of the time didn't hand over the hymn books to those 1950s teenagers in response. And of course, in wider culture, there's more space for those intergenerational changes to happen. 70-year-olds don't need to listen to the same music as 20-year-olds. But when it's a small community and one that measures its lifespan in centuries, then these differences in culture run up against each other much more. And even with the best intentions and a sense of encouragement of the younger generations, it's easy for the older cohorts to assume that the young people will follow the same path that they took. So to give you a little taste, there's a Unitarian society called the Foy Society that started in 1924, and Foy, F-O-Y, stands for Fellowship of Youth, which was a place for young Unitarians to gather back then. But it's now a multi-generational group because members didn't want to leave as they got older. And so now there's members of Foy that are in their 70s and 80s. And there's a new Unitarian group that started recently for young adults called #Blessed. And I know that some of the Foy members have been really encouraging of them and sharing stories of their own group's history and no doubt imagining a similar path. But of course, #Blessed will take their own path and do things that will feel alien or bewildering to Foy, despite being part of the same tradition. So in order to us to avoid the worship of ashes and for a living culture to be kindled, then the path the next generation takes will need to be different. I'm sure you can imagine that these cultural changes are happening at a faster rate than ever before, with global connectivity, meaning that ideas and styles are evolving constantly. And at the same time, with fewer people going to church, especially a small church like ours, there are fewer people holding on to the threads of tradition where the culture changes rapidly around them. We saw some shifts with COVID. All churches had to close in March 2020. And although the rules about opening kept changing, lots of congregations didn't meet in person until summer 2021. So we had a huge boom in online church. Some people were putting videos onto YouTube, some were gathering together on Zoom like this. But it often meant that the most influential person in the congregation switched from maybe being the person who'd been there the longest to the person with the best tech skills, which are often the younger people and newer members. So inevitably brought a culture shift in what Sunday services felt like, on top of their shift to an online format. And we're seeing some of these changes remain and grow, perhaps a speedier culture change than would have happened without that handbrake turn that COVID brought. And usually fast changes cause conflict, but slow changes are slow, and we don't really have time for slow. Either looking inwards for ourselves, some of the smallest congregations, they don't have time for slow change before they'll reach the point of closing their doors. And looking outwards, there's so many people in need of community, in need of spiritual sustenance that don't have somewhere to belong, and slow change won't meet them in time. And I see more and more that the work of maintenance in a community like ours is in strengthening the fabric, adding to the threads, the warp and the weft made by connections between people, the meaningful sorts of connections that can be made in a community that's made to nourish the soul. When the fabric of community is stronger, there's more resilience and change can happen without so much fear of breakage. And for most people, when they do go into a church, it's for a wedding or a funeral. It's those big life markers, a ceremonial occasion, not very often. And those are important moments, but at its best, I think it's the week in, week out Sunday services that are most powerful part of church, and where the fabric of the community gets strengthened. So it's that collective experience, and it's the cups of tea afterwards and the tea towel conversations when you're washing up the cups of tea. And yeah, that's where the threads are strengthened, being witnessed by people who are not quite friends and not quite family, and yet have a vested interest in your life. And it's an incredibly powerful thing, but built very slowly in small threads thread by thread. But it's those connections that mean that a community can become resilient to change. And so why does all of this matter? If a church has had its moment and is fizzling out, why put energy into maintaining it? The way I see it, communities like Unitarian congregations, where people show up week on week to renew their commitment to the common good, have never been more needed. We know that many people in Britain have a difficult winter ahead, and we know that the climate crisis will bring more disruption and more struggle. So we need to know how to take care of each other in ways that aren't really taught in our individualistic consumer culture. And that practice of care is held in relationships and in communities, and it's maintained through connections and culture passed on from person to person. My experience is that we humans naturally want to take care of each other and the wider circles of life. We want to live a life that feels meaningful. We want to feel connected to the community around us. But those values have slowly dropped out of mainstream culture, and community fabric in general is much sparser than it once was. So faith communities are now some of the few places that these universal values are put front and centre. In Britain, many people's ideas about God, about belief, about spiritual practice have shifted so much that many faith groups can feel inaccessible, which is why I'm investing my time in the Unitarian community, which creates space for you to explore your own spiritual path and your own beliefs. And I can see that there's spiritual infrastructure that is worth maintaining. The ideas and practices are passed on through relationships, but also the more tangible infrastructure of buildings and governance structures and bank accounts and training schemes. COVID has put so many pressures on small volunteer-run communities, and a lot of churches are on the brink of closure. And when, of course, when those buildings are lost to the community and sold to property developers, they won't be coming back. And when the stories and practices don't have new relationships to pass them into new hands for the next generation, they will fizzle out. We need to maintain our spiritual infrastructure to keep it in service to the common good. And the way that we do this needs to be attuned to what's needed now, not setting it in stone for the traditions of the past. Thank you.